everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 19th, where we are hitting the midpoint of the semester. So I'm beginning to receive papers, so thank you very much. And it might take me a little bit of time to get to all of those papers, but certainly you'll get those papers in enough time for you to be able to do a revision if you so elected to do so. As you know, everybody has the option of revising that first paper. So I will evaluate it for grammar and mechanics, as well as for content, and give it back to you with the letter grade. And if you're content with your grade at that point, then you have completed the assignment. But if you would like to improve your grade, I ask that you take my comments into account, write a revision, and that when you hand in your revision, that you also hand in the original graded copy with my comments. And that would allow me to compare and contrast the two, and you would get the higher of the two grades. As you know, I'm asking that you submit your papers via email, via PDF, because that's how my grading program works best, and that's Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And in terms of when that revision is due, ultimately you have up until the ending of the semester, but the sooner the better for everybody involved for obvious reasons. And your second paper will be very similar to what you are doing now with your first paper. The difference will be that you are focusing on drama rather than focusing on short story, which is the unit that we are working with right now. And you'll have the options of either writing about canon or writing about contemporary relevance, or creating your own essay topic, just as long as you have that topic approved by me ahead of time. And that second paper will be a critical paper, so no outside resources, and approximately 4 to 5 pages, much like your first paper, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to be able to construct a solid argument. And that said, your second paper would be due at the very ending of the semester, so probably there wouldn't be time to revise. The whole idea is that the first paper is the learning exercise so that you can incorporate that into your second paper. That said, I have had a few students submit in their papers early enough so that we could negotiate the possibility of a revision for paper number 2, but it is not guaranteed the way a revision is with paper number 1. So again, thank you for those of you who have already started to submit in papers. I had indicated that about the next week or so would be ideal for handing in that first paper, because that would put us midway through the semester. So somewhere between Thursday the 19th to Thursday the 26th. And that said, certainly if you needed additional time, we could talk about that, but this puts us halfway through the semester, so I'm beginning to get a little bit anxious if you haven't submitted in a paper by that point. And where we are is having watched a performance of Oedipus the King. So, as you know, watching a performance is never a substitute for reading the play. It's a supplement. And the performance tried to replicate as much as possible what we might have experienced in 430 BC. So that would be a very different kind of experience than going to a play today. So you could see those large padded costumes, and you could see the platform shoes, and you could see the very large masks. All of those things would help us see the characters on stage. Sophocles made drama a little bit more sophisticated by adding a third character, so it would be even more complicated in keeping the character straight if we were sitting in a 14,000 seat Greek amphitheater, which is what the audiences of the time would have experienced. But again, the audiences of the time didn't go to the theater to learn about the play. They already knew the plot, which is why it's important that we know the plot, because that really helps in terms of understanding irony. And the reality of the play itself is that it was one that was supposed to help reinforce community and religious values, as well as ultimately present themes and issues. And I think you'll see that even watching a performance, we can get some of the literary elements of the play, but truly understanding the literary elements of the play is relying on our reading the play, which is also complex because we're not reading the play in its original language. We're reading a translation in English, and the original play was written in poetry. So writing a translation is challenging because it isn't so easy to necessarily give a word-for-word translation from one language to another. In fact, it's impossible. And the fact that it's in poetry means that we, or a translator, is attempting to keep to the musicality of the language, which also doesn't necessarily transfer over easily in another language. So you have one translation in your book, which is different from the translation that we saw perform by William Butler Yeats, a very famous poet. And that performance was done by the Canadian Shakespeare Company. You may have noticed very early on in the performance when we are given some background information about how we should watch the play. This is for audiences who have not read the play. That one of the actors who comes forward, it's an actor from the chorus to give his mass to the narrator. He is William Shatner, very young William Shatner, from Star Trek fame. And I joke that perhaps this is where he learned his acting technique, which is definitely overacting, if you are familiar with William Shatner's interpretation of Captain Kirk. That said, the overacting that we saw in this performance would have been necessary, again, for 14,000 seat amphitheater. So what seems ridiculous through the lens of a camera wouldn't seem ridiculous, again, if we were watching it live and we had a good distance between ourselves and the actors. Of course, the chorus would help as well by reiterating action, so they oftentimes served as narrator, but they could also serve as community and comment on action. You could see how they were all engaged in very similar kinds of behaviors, and that would be very deliberate to sort of illustrate them as an entity of the community itself. Of course, the chanting would serve as a kind of musical soundtrack and would also amplify their voices, though we think that the masks themselves would have had amplification devices. And of course, Greek theater was a marvel of acoustics, as you would have seen in that video that I had asked you to watch. And while there is some interpretation, obviously we don't have an eyewitness to be able to verify what it was that we saw on stage. I think that you can see that there was an attempt to use color imagery in order to reinforce some of the themes of the play. So you might have noticed that Oedipus, the king, was dressed in gold, gold being a very regal color, with blacked out eyes, again, to illustrate the idea that he has physical sight but lacks insight. He does not know what we already know as audience. And of course, we would already know this as audience because we would know the plot ahead of time. And even though Oedipus has established himself as a great riddle solver, note that he was not able to solve the riddle of his own birth. Everybody solves the riddle, even his wife / mother Jocasta, before Oedipus is able to do so. And of course, Jocasta is in silver, silver being also another regal color, but not of the status of gold, which would be Oedipus. And bronze would be for Creon, the brother-in-law, so you could see descent here. Of course, the irony is that Creon doesn't want anything to do with the position of being king, and yet at the ending of the play, he becomes king. And we also see the costume change that Oedipus has by the ending of the play after he gouges out his eyes. Now he's all in red to signify blood, and also he's got a black veil over him to signify that he's blind, literally, physically, though at least at this point he has insight. He's much like Tiresias, the blind prophet. And Tiresias, notice, is all in white, again to illustrate that he has great insight, but really large blacked out eyes to illustrate that he is physically blind. Something like the incense at the beginning of the movie works so well to sort of mimic what we would see with fog And again, the idea of vision and blindness is so important in the play and in the performance of what we can see, what we can't see, and light and dark imagery. Of course, we were watching a performance that was done indoors, so they had artificial lighting for us. That would not have happened in a Greek amphitheater. But I think they took great advantage of the fact that they could show us shadows to illustrate that idea of vision and blindness. Notice how Oedipus's children are all in red, and they are the products of incest, and incest is a blood crime, and of course blood is red. So I think this performance tried as much as it could to sort of reinforce some of the themes that we would be experiencing. And I believe I had talked a little bit about Aristotle, who was perhaps the first literary critic, who at the time had identified Oedipus the King as perhaps the greatest tragedy ever written. One of the historical reasons why we're reading Oedipus the King, that a tragedy has particular elements associated with them, and that they're illustrated beautifully in Oedipus the King. First, it needs to be complex to be considered a piece of literature that we've talked about all semester long. There has to be a depth and a complexity to it. And it has to be about terrible events, because it is, after all, tragic. And we have to feel pity as audience for the character Oedipus the King, who would be considered a tragic hero. A tragic hero would be a great man, above and beyond the ordinary, much better than ourselves, someone that we could respect and admire, who experiences downfall, in part because of flaws in character. This is the learning element for us in the play, that we should not duplicate the tragic hero's mistakes. Hubris or excessive pride is usually a major error, but there are other flaws in character. There are also outside forces, things that are beyond our control. At the time, the language of fate would have been used, but you can use language such as luck for today's contemporary society. And that a tragic hero will ultimately accept their role in their fall because they are a good person. And we pity this individual as audience because they are a good person above and beyond the ordinary. And it's not all of their fault. And we also feel fear because if they could experience this downfall, we can experience the same downfall. One probably much worse because we aren't nearly as sophisticated or aren't nearly as advanced as the tragic hero. And that characters should be necessary for the forwarding of the plot and should engage in probable actions for their characters in the way that they would be written. And, of course, Sigmund Freud was inspired by the play, albeit loosely, to come up with his Oedipal complex, a very famous psychological theory. Freud, of course, has fallen out of favor, but Freud's theory of the Oedipal complex is that young boys see their fathers as competition and have some sort of romantic inclination towards their mothers. That isn't exactly what happens in Oedipus the King, but Oedipus, through no fault of his own, ends up, or perhaps in part because of fault of his own, I take that back, ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. The fault, and this is the crux of the play really, is that Oedipus is arrogant enough to try to defy the gods. And again, we have to talk about this, and we will next class in much greater depth, about how one should humbly accept one's destiny or one's fate. Oedipus tries to change it, and because of that, he actually brings his fate about. And we could say the same for his birth parents as well. A very different way of seeing the world than the way we would see the world today, which is, of course, we would try to take action to prevent a tragedy. But that is one of the ways that the play is different from perhaps our contemporary values. But keep in mind that this is 430 BC, Greece, and a time of gods in the plural, not just one monolithic god. So when we think about Freud and we think about the tragic tradition that playwrights such as Shakespeare are known best for, it's one of these important plays that we need to talk about when we talk about tragedy. And I do think that issues such as fate and free will have a lot of contemporary relevance associated with them. So again, to reiterate the plot, which the text does, I've already done, and performance is done, but again, it's important to understand that the play begins in media res, in the middle, and that Oedipus is trying to solve this horrible plague that's ravaging his community, as we see in the beginning of the play, and that he sends out messengers, including his own brother-in-law, to consult with oracles to see how they've offended the gods so they can rectify the situation. And the response is always the same, that Oedipus himself is responsible. Oedipus is so angered by his own brother-in-law saying that he accuses Creon, his brother-in-law, of trying to steal the kingdom from him. And Creon responds, no, why would I want to do that? I have all of the benefits of being part of the royal family, but none of the terrible responsibilities. Of course, as the play progresses, we're given backstory, and the backstory explains how Oedipus is ultimately responsible, going all the way back to Oedipus's birth parents, who were told the prophecy when Oedipus was a baby that Oedipus would grow up to be a man to kill his father and marry his mother. And his parents decide to defy the gods and try to change this prophecy, and they decide to have the baby killed. They give the baby to a servant in order to kill that baby, Oedipus's parents being a king and queen, so they wouldn't do the dirty work themselves. The servant takes pity on Oedipus and ends up leaving Oedipus in a place where Oedipus is able to be rescued and taken to another kingdom, a kingdom where the king and queen cannot have children. So ultimately, the king and queen not only are thrilled to raise Oedipus, but they raise Oedipus as their own and never tell Oedipus that he is not their birth child, but he is adopted. When Oedipus becomes an adult, Oedipus consults the oracle and is told this terrible prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus, also with a sense of arrogance and hubris, excessive pride, tries to change this terrible fate. Again, from a contemporary standpoint, we can't blame him. But during the time of Greek society, this would be seen as very radical to try to usurp the god's will. And there is punishment for that. What Oedipus decides to do is to leave his father and mother, put as much physical distance between them so he can protect them. The end result, of course, is that he isn't leaving his biological parents. He's leaving his adopted parents. And in fact, he on his travels, he just gets closer and closer to his biological parents. At one point, there's a chariot blocking Oedipus's way on his travels, and Oedipus, who one of his flaws is temper or fit, and a temper or fit ultimately decides to kill all of the people who are blocking his way, and that includes, it turns out, his biological father. And eventually Oedipus goes to a kingdom that is ravaged by plague because of a monster, a sphinx, and the only way to solve the plague or to eliminate the plague is to solve the riddle of the sphinx. Long literary tradition of that. And Oedipus solves the riddle successfully. And that shows Oedipus's great intelligence. Oedipus is rewarded by being given the kingdom because the king had recently been killed. And that also means that Oedipus gets the widowed queen. And lo and behold, it turns out that the widowed queen is Oedipus's birth mother. So when they have children together, that's the ultimate affront to the gods because they're committing incest, which is why the play begins with Oedipus experiencing plague, the wrath of the gods. And I love the production that we saw of Oedipus the King because the actor, I think, is so skilled who plays Jocasta. And of course, the camera helps us with this interpretation as well, that we see the actor turn their head and the camera gives us a close-up. And that's the moment where we can determine that Jocasta has figured out the truth. And obviously, she wouldn't have had sexual relations with Oedipus or married him if she had known the truth. And at that point, her response is quite telling. She tells Oedipus to stop asking questions. So Jocasta would rather that the community suffer and that she protect her nuclear family than have the truth revealed. Oedipus thinks that her concern is that it will be revealed that Oedipus is base-born and she married a commoner. Oedipus has no idea. Even though he's a great riddle solver, he hasn't figured it out yet. Oedipus has no good idea as to why it is that he is responsible for the plague. And then, of course, it's revealed that well, he's killed his father and married his mother, and he finds out about how ultimately his birth parents abandoned him. And Jocasta's response to all of this, once the horrific truth is revealed, is to run off and commit suicide. And Oedipus's response is to gouge out his own eyes that have betrayed him, that he has physical vision, but he doesn't have insight, not like the insight of the blind prophet Tiresias, who tells Oedipus pretty much point blank that you are the reason for the plague. Oedipus refuses to believe it. Of course, by the ending of the play, Oedipus is a tragic hero, and he accepts responsibility for his role in the fall. And he's ultimately exiled, with, ironically, Creon now is running the kingdom, even though Creon didn't want it. Oedipus is allowed to say goodbye to his daughters. Oedipus is particularly concerned for the daughters because at least the boys will grow up to be men who can fend for themselves, but who will marry the girls? And then Oedipus is exiled, and he wanders off on 3 legs, no less, because he's using a cane, which was part of the initial prophecy that, or the initial riddle, I should say, that Oedipus solved with the Sphinx. What walks on 2 legs in the morning, or I should say, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, and that would be a baby crawling at the beginning of life. What walks on 2 legs in the afternoon, that would be an adult walking upright. What walks on 3 legs in the evening being old age, walking with a cane. But it turns out that Oedipus is not necessarily old, but he needs a cane because he's blind. And that's the play Oedipus the King. It's part of a 3-part trilogy. As I had indicated, the second part is Antigone, the story of Oedipus's daughter, all grown up, and Creon, who's been ruling for quite a long time. And in fact, at this point, Creon is engaging in many of the same flaws that Oedipus was, perhaps illustrating how absolute power corrupts absolutely, if I can borrow a phrase from another discipline. The last play is Oedipus at Colonus, and this is the story of Oedipus as an old man and whether or not he has appeased the gods. We're just reading the first play, but of course the story continues, and I believe you have Antigone in your textbook. You may not have Oedipus at Colonus, but you can find it easily enough online. So, the idea of Oedipus being a tragic hero, part of it is that he has flaws in character. And that's going to be today's attendance question, is asking you what flaws do you think, or what major flaw Oedipus engages in. Ultimately, he engages in multiple flaws or errors in character. But what do you think Oedipus's biggest flaw is, and why? Of course, we'll talk about Oedipus the King a little bit more, but I'm well aware that you were writing a paper, so I didn't want to get too much into Oedipus the King at this point. I can do that next class. And you'll notice in the notes below that I've indicated some information about documentation, about when do you document. And you document if you're using an exact quote from a text. You're not using outside resources, so you would need to document those, which means that you don't need to necessarily submit in a works cited page, which would list all of your sources, because I'm assuming you're just using our class textbook. That said, if you do submit in a works cited page, I expect you to do it correctly, and the way that you can find that is either through some of the examples that are given in our textbook, some of the earlier set of readings that we did, or you can reference something like the website Purdue OWL, and I've got the link below, which is a website that talks about the entire writing process, right down to submission, and beginning with generating ideas. Also, the GCC library also has information about writing papers and documenting. And what you're doing is, when you're quoting from a text, immediately after the quote, doesn't matter if you're done with the text or not, you're using parentheses, and within those parentheses, you're indicating the page number of where that quote appears. And then either you're ending your quotation or you're continuing on with your sentence, whatever the case may be. And there's some examples below. Sometimes you might insert your own language into a quote, not to comment on the quote or to analyze it. You can do that elsewhere in the paper. But to clarify something, oftentimes it's a pronoun, because you get to decide what to quote. So you might be quoting a pronoun, and that pronoun is unclear as to which character it's referencing. And you can see I have an example below that you would put that in square brackets. My example is, quote, even his, and then in square brackets, Krebs's. close square brackets. Lies were not sensational. And close quote or end quote marks. And then, of course, we have your documentation, 162 in parentheses, and then our closing documentation. You can omit something in a quote, not to change the meaning, but merely because it's not relevant. And you can omit something with 3 periods, or known as an ellipsis. And you wouldn't begin or end a quote that way because you get to determine where to start and end that quote. So the assumption is that there was more before the quote, more after the quote. But between your starting and ending point, you can use your 3 periods to indicate that you left out a word. Again, you don't want to change intent or content. And you can also use a block quote. And if you've got over 3 lines of written text, you would indent in that quote so that it's very clear just through a visual scan where the quote begins and ends. In this instance, you wouldn't need to use quotation marks. It would be considered redundant because a quote mark basically just tells you that you are quoting. So if you are indenting in your quote, you don't need to do that. One minor difference, however, is that you would put ending punctuation first in a block quote, and then you would put parenthetical documentation. A couple of other points that I wanted to make about writing papers that were included in that handout that I had posted about writing the critical paper. It's usually best to avoid the usage of I because it's usually considered redundant. I think, I believe, I will argue. You can do that elsewhere, or you can do that if you're writing about yourself, a personal experience, but the entire paper is about what you think or what you believe or what you argue. So you don't have to say, I think young Goodman Brown is a hypocrite. You can just say young Goodman Brown is a hypocrite. Avoid contractions whenever possible. Words like don't and can't and won't, where we take 2 words and we contract them into one. They're considered a little bit more informal. Avoid slang, informal language that isn't considered standard. The same with trite expressions, words and expressions that have been used so frequently that they've lost their original meaning. So saying something like someone is a cool person, that would be slang. Technically, what you've just said is they have a low temperature. I understand that when we use the word cool, there is this common understanding that that means somebody who's interesting. But imagine if English were not your first language. There's just a greater possibility of misunderstanding. The same with trite expressions, rather than saying it's raining cats and dogs or dead as a doornail or whatever the case may happen to be, better to put it in your own language. In fact, when we get to Shakespeare, we'll even talk about how some of these expressions were created by Shakespeare, but they were original at the time, and basically they aren't now. In other words, we quote Shakespeare all the time. We don't even realize that we're quoting Shakespeare. So those are some of the suggestions I have. And to try to be concise, look at each of your sentences and ask yourself, can I rephrase this in fewer words? And if so, generally speaking, do so, because you probably have a tighter piece of writing. There are exceptions, the contractions, for instance. Obviously, if you used a contraction, it would be fewer words, but again, contractions are considered informal. So you want to use your judgment. So these are just a few of the points for you to consider with writing. Again, I wanted to end this here so that you can continue to work on your paper. Next class, we'll put some closure on Oedipus the King and talk a little bit about some of the elements within the play, and then we'll move forward into Shakespeare. So again, your attendance question, which would be due that would be, let's see, today is for our Thursday class, so that would be due on Saturday. And of course, if you need an extension, just let me know. What do you think is Oedipus's biggest flaw and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class with Oedipus the King. Take care. Bye-bye.